Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine archery training roughly during the 6th century, the Justinian era, and we will give a look to a bunch of sources that tell us how it practically worked. So, archery in the 6th century is particularly important because the Byzantine army at this point begins to rely pretty heavily on mounted archers, on cavalry in general, but especially on the especially if you look at the larger numbers, horse archery was now a very important thing. The heavier cavalry obviously remains the bulk of cavalry force, the critical mass, the shock power. But still, in warfare, most of the actions were carried out by lighter troops. In this case, of the cavalry, of horse archers, that at this point do not pop out of the blue, without apparent reason. This is a pretty, clearly determined historical period. We're in the 6th century, or towards the end of the migration era. You can extend that if you want. It really depends from which perspective you look at, and objectively, from the Byzantine one, much more than from Western Europe, you realize that the contact with these migrating peoples was pretty intense. It remained pretty intense for quite a long time, so that the migration era in the East never quite ended, if you want. At least the empire, as well as Eastern Europe in general, was always in contact with this broader area of the steppes towards which the Roman Empire had started to gravitate on the Bosphorus, so between the Aegean and the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is in the north, obviously occupied, aside from the Byzantine colonies in Crimea and southern Ukraine, on these big steppes, right? So where lots of peoples are still on the move. They're still penetrating to the Balkans and kind of knocking at the Byzantines' door. And as always, this brought same Byzantines first to adopt part of the same ethnic components of these populations, like hiring mercenaries. Think about the so-called summakoi in Greek, what had been the federati in Latin, that are obviously very varied. The empire at this point hired basically everyone available and exploiting all the various tactical specialties. But there is this very strong influence of the steppe that, especially after the biggest waves of the migration era, had made pour lots of these troopers into the Byzantine army that progressively started to copy them, right? And this is typical of the Byzantines, that you can't really see a big deal of difference between their tactical specialties and the ones of peoples around, because after having absorbed these elements that knew how to fight in that way, basically they learned how to train their own troops to fight in the same exact way. So towards the later empire, this the military training actually intensified. Late Roman imperial training was much more intense, much longer, especially than the one of the previous centuries, and it was aimed exactly at in giving this kind of 360 degrees ability in all kind of weapons, actually, because at this point a Byzantine caballarius, just to make a banal example, as the average let's say campaign trooper of the Byzantine army, would be essentially indistinguishable from many other peoples in some ways. There is not much difference between that and a Longobarд Arimanus, or between that and, let's say, a Hunnic cavalryman, in the ability of fighting with all several weapons. So they were trained really to use every kind of weapon, and archery had been increased, like for these very reasons, because the empire had to cope with these avalanches, actually, of mounted peoples that you can't. There is no much other way to cope with, but increasing in turn the amount of horse archers that were the bulk of numerical bulk at least of those armies as well. So archery training increased a freaking lot. And this is not because of the peoples of the steppes. This is also in the East, of the Persian tradition, that naturally sees a lot of horse archering, that however in origin came exactly from the same steppes in terms of military culture and tradition. So it's basically that thing. In Western Europe, you have much less of that on average, even though basically every cavalryman, you can argue there, even though now in Western Europe we're kind of settling down, like Germanic warriors from their semi-nomadic mansion to a sort of, sedentary peasantry, right? So losing, even because of social stratification, this need of, using archery on kind of an effective level, especially on horseback. Right? But the European aristocracy maintained always a pretty solid archery skills throughout all the period. If you look, at medieval times, that's the same exact thing. Same Byzantine emperors, by the way, were, they had to participate in these models that were drawn, in fact, in part also from Persia. This idea of the hunt, right? Participating to the hunt. There is a lot of let's say, of iconography and ideology in the Byzantine world, relative to the Byzantine emperor as the greater warrior that fights not just against human enemies, but also against great animals like lions and other symbols of virility and strength and fierceness, let's say, and archery was the obviously the master skill on horseback for hunting, but as well as for fighting as well. So the ability in archery naturally at this point therefore constituted the fundamental element of military preparation, both for the infantryman, never to forget, and the horseman. In the 6th century, as we were saying, the Byzantine army kind of really starts evolving towards a more mounted outlook, right? The great campaigns, for instance, the reconquest of Africa, of Italy, of Spain, etc., are carried out, as you know, with very light armies. Numerically speaking, most of them were mounted. And this was important because it kind of increased its strategical mobility, at least up to a certain point. But it was also kind of more flexible, more adaptable, especially to tougher ground where the skirmishing tactics were quite important. And but still, infantry was equipped as well with bow and arrows, right? This was something that the Romans started to. The Romans up to, let's say, the 4th century hadn't been so, they hadn't cared excessively about archery. They had kind of developed it, especially when it came to the eastern frontiers against the Persians, against the Sarmatians. They didn't quite have a very strong body of archers on their own. And from the 4th century, from the Constantinian reforms, etc., and especially in the eastern half of the empire, there is this injection of archers and of archery training, especially for infantry. And this is particularly interesting because it's the same thing that you find starts happening even among the Germanic populations that set themselves on the march during the migration era. The Germans hadn't done quite a big deal of use of bow and arrows back in the day. Probably this has been a bit exaggerated, and it probably has to do with a kind of tribal and heroic mindset of the German world, for which shooting someone at distance was kind of cowardly. But hey, if you look at Germanic epics, you realize that there is always some arrow popping out and or other missile weapons that kill the hero of the situation. So that's a very strongly and not just anthropological but also military observation of those moments, those times. But let's say that when these peoples get on the march, and especially they get accomplished, they get acquainted, in turn with other let's say of nomadic peoples, nomadic populations made extensive use of horse archery. The Germans that never quite became kind of a fully nomadic peoples, even during even if the most influenced, like the Ostrogoths, etc., they couldn't transform the whole army to horse archers, but they start equipping their cavalry as well as their infantry with bow, right? So, and sometimes, especially the subdued populations that they had got among the, along the migratory way, they had subdued, and they were not freemen, so they had to kind of to work for the freemen. There were warriors, usually fought with a sword, with a lance, etc., were generally poorer and required sort of as a class of recruitment. But it's sometimes that's really what they had in practice, to provide to provide bow and arrow. We have talked about that quite often in somewhat detail when talking about the Longobards, that we have dedicated some military video to. But this is you can find it basically everywhere, in every single Romano-Germanic people, and that's something that continued. You find it actually throughout the whole Middle Ages, as well as thinking about even Longobards recruitment in the 8th century, when the people was fully sedentarized. But just today I was reading about the seizure of arms in the 13th century England, where you realize that obviously all the lower classes of recruitment were to be equipped at least with bow and arrow, right? So that was kind of the standard. And this is fascinating because probably we have gotten kind of a let's say a bit of a stereotypical picture of the migration era, for which there is this sharp division between the equipment and skills of, let's say, kind of the western half of Europe and the eastern half. But actually, probably archery warfare was pretty well widespread all over the rest of Europe, and it's being concealed partly by that kind of heroic ideal of the fighter that had to meet the enemy face to face and not doing sneaky things like throwing at a distance. But it turns out that if you go deeper into the analysis of the sources and you look at archaeology, etc., we know that it was full of arrows all around, right? Just the other day, a user asked me, looking at that video on medieval Ireland, the early medieval Gaelic warfare, why there is such a few bow and arrow, and the truth in that context before the Viking invasion, I will respond that to, as I told him in the next Q&A video. But you have to take into consideration that it's in that case, I believe it's also there are some reasons that are probably structurally telling us, yeah, there was kind of less use of bow and arrows in Ireland at that point. But it's also that we don't quite know. I mean, because the rest of the sources are kind of non-existent. Most of all, it's so scanty. We don't even have the certainty. And say bows and arrows are not something that survive excessively, or at least given the arrow ads definitely do. But finds are scattered and so on. So. Looking at even at Byzantine infantry, I started from this. You have to think that it was particularly important to know how to use an arrow, especially from the 4th century onwards. The Roman infantry has this way increased and superior, let's say, fire range and firepower, missile power, let's say, than previous Roman legions. And this was something embarrassing, because the Roman legion before had kind of just the pila, right, and some kind of catapults and stuff like that. From this time onwards, in late Roman Empire, you have bullets and projectiles that go at a much longer range, sometimes with even a greater ability of penetration, and it kind of increases over time. And infantrymen were trained to use both, like to act both as spearmen as missile troops. Not necessarily with archery. There were also other kind of darts, like the plumbata, Matteo Barbolo, as they were called. But the general concept is that now the Byzantine army has this very intense missile power that in the 6th century gets especially concentrated into cavalry as very, let's say, a protagonist arm. We can say that cavalry at this point becomes really the decisive element. I mean, it's still kind of especially because for the West it's definitely not true, but if you look at the East, you can say, well, but there was a lot of cavalry warfare at that point. Where's the limit? We'll talk about that on another occasion, but say it starts, however, increasing importantly, even to deal, and especially to deal with infantry, because the tactics now the Byzantines were performing were aimed like the one, just like the ones of the steppes, to basically soften up the enemy ranks formations with this archery fire, and then in order to charge them now with heavier units, heavy cavalry, sure, but also infantry. But in this case, making this kind of combined armed tactics that were pretty devastating, even not just even physically, but especially psychologically, and that with great effect, because we know that the Byzantines basically reconquered the whole Western Mediterranean like that, right? And not just because of archery, but that was an essential arm at that point. So basically the Roman horsemen at this point had to train archery with rapidity, especially, both on foot and on horseback. And this is the idea of rapidity, of speed, is particularly important, because when we talk about many reconstructions have concentrate on the individual side of the story, right? How fast a horseman can, an archer can shoot fundamentally, and the question is, it probably has to do with how much he individually trains, but still, the training has to be performed in several different ways. Training information is particularly complex. It has different objectives, right? Especially information. You don't really aim at an enemy in particular, not usually, but these guys were trained to do exactly that in those conditions where, like they were personally an individual. And there was a lot of training, in fact, based exactly on this, as we will see now. But there is also the concerted use of missile fire that is particularly important, because it may switch, right? If you throw all arrows information, you throw out the enemy formation. At that point, you have to calibrate accurately your fire in different ways. It's not important to be that fast in that case, but rather to kind of synchronize that with this bigger waves of arrows that have the objective to kind of shatter the enemy ranks all en masse. And then there is naturally the individual training, as we were saying, that instead, like especially in in individual fighting, is important indeed, together with the other arms. So the Roman horsemen, in this sense, had to be able to shoot from whichever position and whichever pace gaze of the horse, right? So this is important because naturally you can find yourself in several different situations which you don't have many options whether to to stop your horse or not. So the ideal was to be able to shoot like the finest archers out there, especially ones of the steppes, etc., or in Persian tradition, even when you were kind of retreating, etc., in every kind of speed, in every kind of movement. So the problem was training them in order to do exactly that, especially in a world, and remember this, that wasn't quite the same as the one of the steppe, where you didn't really need a training, because basically you were trained to do that since you were little, in some ways, because you just lived that. It was the environmental conditions out there that had shaped that type of warfare, that type of tactics. In the Byzantine world, this is in great part artificial, because even though lots of horse archers poured, as we said, into the Byzantine army, and they were used maybe just on contract for some time to serve the imperial army, definitely this Roman soldiers proper were not nomads, were people who lived their century life. So that's why training becomes so important and becomes so long in time, especially because they had to lack in this sense they had to compensate the lack of training that the average, let's say, warrior out there, that the Byzantine soldier was trained to do since it was little, right? So there is this, and this means a lot of resources invested into this, because you have to feed the soldiers, you have to provide them with the equipment, with the time, you have just to keep them training and not employing them for some time. So time training was extremely long. It took even decades to reach that in the meanwhile. There was also this different shot, kind of, it's the Roman and the Persian way, that basically consists into the Roman manner basically consisted into the adoption of a technique of hooking that today is called like Oriental or Mongolian, that at the time the Byzantines had probably assimilated from the Huns and other peoples of the steppes that had invaded Europe since the 4th century. And basically with this technique, the bow's string was drawn, and by hooking it, let's say, with the thumb and superimposing the index to render safer and more steady the hook, right? And in order to give a greater security to this hook, you could also use the help of a further with a sort of ring that was tied to the string in the point of the notch. And generally the shooters at this point used as kind of a metal ring, but sometimes it could be also in bone or leather that was inserted put around the thumb to facilitate the hook to the string, and that could be used in all safety given the strength employed by the arm. And this impostation, this setting, let's say, unitedly to the fact that the bow was thrown usually from the right side of the bow, it helped the horsemen to have that, kind of a higher rate of fire, and especially an increased power, right? That was due to the capacity of the thumb to impress this greater force, and therefore a greater draw. Besides a smaller interference between the string at the moment of release, right? Then there was the Persian manner that instead consisted into hooking the string with the last 3 fingers of the hand, with the index aligned along the axis of the arrow, and in this manner the fire rate was higher compared to the Roman way, the Roman technique, but the firepower was decisively less, just like Procopius observes, and when he states, this is Procopius 1:1830, that the Roman archers were superior to the Persian ones because of the greater strength with which they threw the arrows. And actually the Persian technique had a very ancient origin that dated back to Assyrian times. These are kind of, at least traditionally, it can be at least seen in a beautiful relief of a hunting scene of King Assurbanipal that you can see at London, at the British Museum. In fact, it was known even as the Assyrian hooking technique, let's say. It sounds bad. But that's what it was, and however, there was probably, and this is just for the sake of completion, a hooking technique that was more specifically Sassanid at this time, that entailed both the middle finger and the annular finger while the last one, the last finger remained free, and the thumb cooperated with the index to maintain the arrow notched. And this is a very well evident technique, especially from the 3rd century onwards. On many reliefs, there is a beautiful silver plate that shows, I think, a lion hunting of King Shapur II in the 4th century. This should be in St. Petersburg at the State Hermitage Museum, and these were all techniques specifically conceived for horse archery, so mounted archery, and because the finger basically had the function to avoid that the notch of the arrow could get out, right, from the string during the bouncing up and down on horseback, right? So this was particularly important because it was also a matter of being ready with your arrow notched and not getting surprised by certain accidents that actually we know on horseback were pretty frequent. Fighting on horseback is definitely not a good. And bear in mind that at this time, stirrups weren't quite out there. So we know actually from Procopius that when the Byzantines were fighting against the Ostrogoths in Italy, that was a hell. There were a lot of people falling from horseback, getting these horrendous wounds and fractures and all this stuff because they didn't have this further support. And that's probably what it brought them to be used, especially in the East it kind of arrived from but it seems that the Byzantines mostly got stirrups from the other side. Some say from the Huns as well, but chiefly it's both in Western and Eastern Europe, seemingly something that happened. However, through the let's say the Eastern European channel, let's say, not from the East, not from Persia, etc. So naturally, the names of these techniques are kind of, relative. I mean, I don't think personally that the Romans had invented, the Roman technique. Obviously, there was this claps, this kind of hooks the rings that made the thing more firm. So that sounds maybe for the adaptation of someone who was not excessively used to archery, so that it had to use this artificial thing aside from just the hand, naked hand. But at the same time, I think that these methods with the clip, let's say, were employed actually also elsewhere. So it's, at least this is now not an I actually don't know, but I think this was the case, meaning that, however, a lot of know-how was definitely absorbed from these other populations. And by the way, it's not that there is one people that is cleverer than the other. If people use certain type of weapons, it's because their society produced them for those needs. So naturally, the individual man can be more or less intelligent, but if this starts happening at a structural level, it's because there is some valid structural reason. And when you fight, especially, you don't really want to waste time on things that do not work. It's in war. It's kind of some of the most refined, sophisticated ways of ensuring the highest effectiveness rather than else. But it's interesting, however, to see that at the time there was this different categorization, whichever their bases, but which we don't know, I believe, were, because evidence is pretty scanty. So, and as we were saying before, so this is clear, right? The Roman technique there's greater power, but less, a lower fire rate. The Persian one, higher fire rate, less power. So you find in Byzantine treatises there's sometimes these ethnical names given that you don't really know whether they were taken from a strategical theater or from that specific enemy, or whether it was an internal thing. So these ethnical names kind of have a relative, they're not really specific. They don't have a scientific connection with that specific people they're referring to. So as we were saying before, even the infantrymen had to be trained to shoot very rapidly with a bow, and this was practiced in several ways. For instance, with a lance that was placed at a certain distance, and he was trained both with the Roman and the Persian technique, and this was all practiced together with, in full gear. So and they were trained to shoot even by using the shield at the same time with one of the arms, right? And you see, it's plenty of evidence. We will see it even afterwards. Now with the sources we're reading, that there was plenty of shields that were kind of even tied to either close to the neck or on your back or to the arm, and normally in this case getting kind of shorter. This is typical of horse archers that even have the need of greater speed, so sometimes at that point less protection can give you this greater speed because of less weight, that maybe it's even better, right? And this was balanced out. So you see that obviously the even overly armored cavalrymen, so the kind of the heaviest cavalry, tended to have smaller shields because naturally you had the armor. It was already very even by itself, but kind of middle cavalry had larger shields, while skirmishing cavalry usually had smaller ones. Also because they were kind of more fast-moving, often in a less disordered formation, so they were individually kind of more difficult targets to hit, so probably that added to this lesser protection. So the importance of archery in the 6th century is very well highlighted by Procopius. Here from the passage from Book 1, to chapter 1 to paragraph 8 to 17, that describes the modern combat of his time, and was pointing out the difference with the archers of older times, right? So of classical times, who, according to him, were so neglecting their archery technique that they drew they pulled the string of the bow only up to their own chest, so that the shot was the arrow that was shot was unavoidably devoid of strength and innocuous for those who were hit. And this, as it's evident, he says, was archery into antiquity. So here, basically, Procopius is saying, in ancient, he's trying to rationalize, motivate, maybe a bit too positivistically, why archery was, kind of less important in the ancient world. Which is true, because normally, in classical times, was not a huge deal of archery. On this, we would maybe have to talk a little bit, because that was probably hidden also for similar reasons to the ones we were telling you before, because of this still heroic mindset that in the ideal, in the model, didn't give so much important. But definitely, classical warfare was not marked by a very intense use of arrow fire, especially in what concerns like the Greeks, the Romans, then also the Celts, the Germans, these populations, Carthaginians, etc. So here it's definitely kind of a naive explanation, because that happened for different reasons. It's not that archery in the ancient world was less developed than this time, because these guys hadn't understood that they had to pull the string more, and that they didn't. These weren't morons, evidently. But still important that Procopius tells us that that this had changed. So he was perceiving the evolution in archery at this point. In fact, he continues by saying, "But the archers today go into battle by wearing armor and equipped with greaves and that arrive up to their knees, and their arrows are slung on the right side, their sword on the left side, and there is some of them who has a slang on the torso, basically, so from one side or behind, and on their shoulders a sort of small shield without handle. So it means basically tied to the back to close. Here, in fact, it says to protect the area of the face, interestingly enough, and the neck. So this is very interesting because, as a description, it's the typical horseman of the steppes. I mean, this in the ancient world, while Greeks and Romans fought in another day, in the steppes, at least the heavier cavalrymen fought exactly in this way, and this tells you basically how Roman cavalry, the 6th century, had basically become a copy in the armament, in the equipment of the same, let's say, medium and heavy cavalries of the steppes. So you have bow and arrow, sword, a lance, swung on the back. So basically, here what it tells you is that they were trained to pass from one weapon to another. Right, first the bow. I mean, either the bow or the lance, depending on the situation. This is particularly important because, historically speaking, let's say wherever there is horse archery, and there is actually also heavy cavalry as well, in lesser numbers, but not to a lesser tactical effectiveness, because that's what the whole combined tactics work about. The horse archer can create this tremendous arrow fire, but if it's not heavily equipped, if it's not heavy cavalry, can't exploit the damage that has created on the enemy lines. So, and same goes for the heavier cavalry that cannot basically charge into a formation that has not been expressly softened up for the charge. So that at this point, still heavy cavalry is kind of weaker than infantry on average. We're not still in the high Middle Ages, but so that there was in the steppe in general some hybrid of these typologies of cavalrymen. So that I mean, not just in this case of the steppes, but also in other populations that used horse archery. I mean, in other places, like chiefly of the steppes, because that's what was the warfare of the steppe. The evolution, the normal evolution, was to distinguish accurately the tactical employment of heavy cavalry and of horse archers, so that they acted as they were different, and they acted as two kind of specialized bodies, right? But there was, in general, also this hybrid that originally probably corresponded to the average warrior, right? Especially when armies were not particularly large, they hadn't particularly developed, that was capable of performing both tactical roles, that is, horse archery and shock cavalry, at the same time. And this requires an enormous ability of training. So it's particularly important because, naturally, even the heavier cavalry, as we were saying at the beginning, knew how to shoot a bow, right? But they usually were prepared in larger bodies on the battlefield to be all about heavy cavalry, heavy shock cavalry, right? Because it would have been let's say a waste of energies to maybe make these guys throwing with arrow. It was something exhausting, actually. It's not. It's definitely not something easy. Given that they were already, very heavily loaded with armor and all this stuff. So there was this tactical differentiation. What do you find at Byzantines in here is that they had drawn so intensely from this military tradition that they had even been able at least in theory, because the tactical distinction existed also in the Byzantine Empire, of course. However, to produce warriors or soldiers, because here, by the way, Procopius is talking about the wall troopers of the empire. So both the barbarians that were hired, so both the guys who came straight from the source of the spring of that military culture, and the Byzantine soldiers proper to fight, using at the same time being equipped exactly for this, both bow and lance. That is, to both harass the enemy with arrows and then charging them once they're tired down. This is fantastic because it really tells you at which point of specialization and training and military quality Byzantine cavalry had arrived at this point. Very interesting is also this. Here it says a sort of small shield without a handle to protect the area of the face and the neck, which doesn't say whether it's symmetrical or asymmetrical. That is, whether it's only from one side or another. Usually, the shield is obviously still in the well, sometimes it can be even in the right side actually, but in this case, especially for archers. But in some armors of the steppes, what you have, there was this kind of lamellar. It wasn't properly a shield; it was a piece of armor that, however, encompassed. There was like a plate all around the back of your head. So at the point probably of not losing lateral sight, but still enough to protect your head from the behind, from the slight angle, from the slight side, let's say. And this naturally was developed because of the very intense fire that existed in the steppe of arrows, right, of the arrow shot. And even if you wonder where cataphracts come conceptually from, they don't come excessively from the concept of the cataphract of the ancient world wasn't really pure shock cavalry. The first need for which those populations had developed that form of armor was chiefly protecting themselves from arrow fire. Because then, of course, you need heavier breeds to have all that metal on their back and all this stuff, so you can use them even to charge and to specialize in that sense. But first of all, before even getting to the charge, you have to be protected, because in the meanwhile, you're gonna get around an arrow shower that you cannot really escape. So it was fundamental to be very well protected, and this part of Procopius, these passages of Procopius really tell you that it was probably something similar. I'm not telling you this wasn't. I don't know how it was, because it's not more specific, but it's still very important that it's mentioned in this passage. Then, still talking about the cavalrymen of his times, Procopius says they are able horsemen, and they are able to aim easily with their bows in every direction while they gallop full speed, and hitting an enemy both while they are pursuing him, whether they are being pursued in turn, right? So this is the Parthian shot. The Parthian shot, it was something that struck the Roman classical sources, because basically the Parthians and other peoples of the steppes had this tactics of shooting even when they were retreating, right? It was considered an enormously cowardly thing by the military edists and the Indo-Europeans that now had kind of settled down. This is kind of interesting because obviously for the Indo-Europeans of the steppes, the individual strength was all there, but still made extensive use of those tactics. From the ones that had sedentarized, like the Greeks, the Romans, looking at these Eastern cavalries, they said, "Oh my God, it's so cowardly," but it's very effective because basically it's continuous fire, right? And it's very useful, needless to say. So here Procopius says that tactic had been perfectly absorbed by the Romans themselves. Then he goes on and says they pull the string of the bow for all the length of the front and up to the right ear. says almost up to the right ear. So giving thus to the arrow such a power to kill whoever lays in the trajectory, since shield and armor are not able to stop its force. Naturally, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it kind of gives you the idea that here he's evidently concerned about stressing that unlike the ancient archers, now the archers of the 6th century had this greater bow draw and consequently a higher and more powerful arrow shot that not even shield or armor could stop. Naturally, this is very ideal and theoretical. Obviously, such protections could be pierced theoretically in various degrees, but let's say that the most important thing here is to say that most of troops at that time were not armored. Here we're talking about the early Middle Ages, 6th century. The ancient world has very much declined. It's a very poor world, materially speaking. So very few of all the troops are actually armored. So you realize that even why archery, this was a factor, probably contributed to spreading even these missile weapons, because armor was becoming something kind of more, more difficult to find. Sometimes we know that Byzantine horsemen even lacked armor. Like in the Ostrogothic campaign, they had to use sometimes wood. It's better than nothing, and it's cheap, and you can wood armor, right? Even for cavalry, and especially actually for also for against archery in this sense. But you understand that it was a pretty bloody affair anyway. Lots of swords and other darts and weapons all around. Then, today I would like to read to you, let's see how many they are. They are basically 5. Yes, there are 4 chapters, let's say, of the Peristrategices or Strategices at this time, also known as Peritoxeias, which in Greek means basically either on strategy, but also known as on archery, because this is the importance that this text has, let's say. That is a text written in Justinian times, so right exactly at this time, even of Procopius and this tactics in the 6th century, that tells a lot on the actual training of Byzantine archers, right? And has this evident aim. I mean, we don't really know who this text was destined to, whether it was even a kind of a military manual or something like that was actually used for training troops. We don't know, but evidently it has very practical and interesting advice to give, and it dedicates 4 entire chapters to the training with bow that make up almost of a treaty within the treaty, right? So this is number 44 on archery title. Then let's read it together. So in archery there are 3 objectives. One is shooting with precision. Second, shooting with force. Third, shooting rapidly. The usage of the bow is effective only when we are confronting the enemy. Actually, not only when we are confronting the enemy, but also when we retreat or we pursue him. You can shoot to static targets by standing or firm or in motion, actually, or targets in movement while you instead are static or moving yourself in turn. So the shot is more precise when you shoot while you're firm to a static target. So, and which is obvious, and less precise if you are in movement and even less if it's the target who is that is in movement. So the archer that shoots in movement can be precise if he shots into the opposite direction from which the one it's moving. When the pursuer throws to the one who flees, or who flees throws at the pursuer, both are obviously on horseback. For the infantry, it's easier to shoot sideways, both in the pursuits and in the retreats, but usually when they shoot at a target in movement, they miss that. So this is interesting because it's not necessarily factual, I believe, but it's still kind of interesting. So first things first, it says, very simply, if you stand firm without moving, it's easier to shoot at a target, and obviously it's easier if you shoot at a static one rather than one is moving, and it's way more difficult when you are moving yourself in turn, right? So and here it's interesting. It says that an archer that shoots in movement can be more precise if he shoots in the opposite direction to the one in which he's moving, right? So I don't really know what it means in here, because first thing it comes into my mind that if you shoot to a target that is indeed that you're kind of going running away from, first of all, your shot is less effective, and it's not. Why should it be more precise, actually? I mean, I don't think it makes a lot of sense at the end of the day, but whatever, here's what it says. Then here it says another thing that is particularly interesting, that is the one, if there is someone who is being pursued, that's, to make the long story short, it's because he's on horseback. So he's basically saying that infantry doesn't run or doesn't shoot running, right? And which is and now understand what it means. Basically, is that on horseback you can turn. I mean, it's the horse that is actually running. You can turn on horseback to shoot backwards, right? Here it says instead that the infantry. So that's the only way. You can be only on horseback if you're shooting at the guy who is pursuing you. But theoretically, and this is true also for who is pursuing, because while you're running, still, yeah, you can technically shoot in front of you, but it's very complicated, and you tend to stay pretty much, to bounce a lot, and accuracy is going to decrease. On horseback, with your thigh muscles, you can, even without stirrups, you can form a sort of suspension. You can try to absorb better the bouncing and to shoot kind of more comfortably, but obviously it's still very difficult to shoot from horseback in the first place. Then here it says for the infantry, it's way easier to throw sideways, right? Both in the pursuits and in the retreats. So this means basically that if you're running against someone, it's easier to shoot someone, let's say, also actually in that is in the front of you. Here it doesn't really say that. It's still difficult, but you're kind of but here it says that basically it's and if you think about it, it seems as if shooting sideways while you're running, it's relatively more feasible. Probably has to do with the way you pull the you stretch the bow, and how your arms are put in axis with your chest. It's kind of more complicated to shoot in the front of you than on the side of you, because by the way, you even have, I'm trying it right now, you have your arm is gonna be kind of more stretched on the side let's say it kind of has a longer reach on the side than on the front, so it can provide to a sort of better pull. I don't know, I'm just guessing, I'm not counting on the exact accuracy of what he's saying, but kind of makes sense. But here it says also, and both while they're pursuing then into retreats, and then he states that, and it's obvious that these are all considerations that he's making by approximation on average, that when there is a moving target, a target that is moving, generally infantry doesn't they tend to miss it, right? And here it doesn't specify whether the infantry is moving as well or they stand firm, but I believe what he's saying here is that infantrymen are less trained, possibly, or less effective in some way than horsemen on shooting, which is an interesting conception, because actually the here is not comparing it in any way to a horse archer with idling, right, while shooting. But the idea is that, objectively, I think if you are trained to shoot from horseback in movement on a regular base, you're kind of more accurate. You have a kind of have way higher training than a guy that just shoots from foot, that generally moves much less. Therefore, is not used to rely on some tricks, skills, or ability to hit a target while he's moving regularly. So this could be an explanation that the horse archer, while while idling, tends to have, in fact here it says usually, a higher accuracy than the regular infantryman. And this might have to do with the higher degree of specialization that horsemen usually had compared to infantry, right? And this for various reasons that you can think. Of course, there could be infantrymen that maybe didn't know how to go on horseback. They were maybe way finer archers than horsemen. But it may as well mean that usually horse archers were kind of either foreigners who maybe knew how to do that very like warriors, so they had kind of grown either on horseback or however shooting bows in general, or they were, the horsemen at this time were getting a higher degree of specialization by training in the same Byzantine army than the infantry. That was gradually becoming kind of a secondary thing, especially the lighter infantry that tended to be the one equipped with bows, while the heavier one was kind of more specialized into hand-to-hand combat rather. So it's kind of understandable in this sense. So the horseman is a soldier you invest more training than a regular infantryman that was. At this point, the average infantryman was a pretty light one, but it had chiefly this kind of skirmishing skills required, probably, even to assist the cavalry. So, sometimes in these treatises you find this sort of Sibling phrases, but so it's fascinating to try to interpret them. Then, if you have a better idea, just speak up, because I know as much as you, I believe, about this. Then it goes on and says, some archers clasp the cord with three intermediate fingers, some only with 2 fingers. Of those who will use 2 fingers, some press the thumb over the index, and other do the contrary, right? These, however, shoot with the cord more backwards, and they shoot the arrow with a greater strength. So here it's basically describing the Roman shot. And previously, the one with 3 fingers, intermediate fingers, it was the Persian the Persian shot, the Persian manner of shooting at least. So he's restating what Procopius said. And then he adds, everybody should, by the way, with practice in both ways, so that when, and this is particularly interesting, when the fingers used become too tired for the continuous effort, you can use the others. So you realize this is fascinating, that the Roman technique and the Persian technique could be used in as a sort of alternative at this point, not for particular fashion, etc., but just for not tiring excessively the single fingers, right? So this is, that professional archers, and you can't see even in the Mary Rose, on the corpses of the Mary Rose longbowmen in the 16th, if I'm not wrong, century, they had this old kind of arthritis and all this stuff. I mean, actually arthritis there is no proof, in my opinion, that arthritis, medically speaking, starts because of these things, but naturally, think about all the tendons, the consumption over the articulations. If you try and exercise over and over and over and over again, just these articulations of the fingers, by the way, are very delicate, etc. So this could be important even in combat, because naturally, if you get tired, you tend to impress less force, so you can switch to the other fingers and obtain, and still shooting, but with the different effects that those two types of techniques have entailed, as we've seen before. So here, then it continues, it says, the bow flex by, let's say, pulling the cord towards the ear, sometimes towards the neck, sometimes toward the chest, and bringing the cord backwards until up to the ear makes the shot more powerful. Less if it's pulled only until up to the neck, and least of all if pulled up to the chest. And it is said that the Amazons used this latter method to pull the bow, to draw the bow, because they here it says because they lacked the force to throw. I don't remember, but I don't understand here what it says actually, but because it says they could bruise their breasts while they were pulling it when they were relieving the cord and shooting. And this is true because, by the way, it can happen in archery even as well, that it takes, first of all, a lot to train a good archer, right? And after months of training, people they're try to use the bow, they still bruise their cheeks because the cord swings is relieved and kind of scratches their faces because it's too close. So it's all very there are lots of forces impressed in this exercise. Then it says, in shooting against infantry or cavalry deployed in the front, you don't have to shoot straight in line in front of you, but sideways, so that unless you have to shoot at the legs of the horses. In fact, every enemy in the front is protected by the shield. So this can be useful not only in a regular battle, but also in the pursuits and in the retreats. So here is saying basically that the shield of the enemy infantry and even cavalry is used in the front. This is an interesting information because it's often overlooked that even cavalry can use things like a shield wall. Think about how Otto the Great actually was Henry the Fowler, if I'm not wrong, at Riade, told to his Saxon cavalry to form a sort of shield wall on horseback against the Hungarian, the Hunger, let's say, better horse archers, right? And here it's saying kind of a similar thing. That is that it's useless for you to throw in that way. But there is another problem, that is, in the front you have still the horse. I mean, you don't just shoot at the at the horseman, do you? I mean, it's way easier sometimes to shoot at the horse. That is a pretty, it's an astonishingly resistant animal, etc. But also very delicate and can be crippled very easily, etc. So at this time, Byzantine cavalry does have some form of armor, telling the truth, especially in the front. But most of cavalry probably didn't. I mean, here we've seen before that even horsemen sometimes didn't have enough armor, and by rule, cavalry has always preferred to first, if there was some form of armor available, always kind of protect the horseman first and then the horse. Naturally, this is not just a protective function, but also, if you load the horse in armor, not only costs way more, and to make it simple, at this time, basically there weren't even the resources to field full cataracts, but because it costs too much. But it also makes that cavalry ultra heavy, and sometimes speed can be more effective, tactically speaking, even than protection. Right? So it's a simple. It could be calculated mathematically depending on the situation, what is more or less convenient, depending obviously on what maneuvers you want to achieve and all this stuff. But it's very theoretical, but that's the substance. So I don't understand here why it says like this. If not for the fact, here it says, unless you don't want to shoot to the horse legs. Right, so here's probably thinking really that maybe the horse chest in fact could be protected by something, even the head. In fact, the only kind of horse armor at this point was chest and head armor. And that was already very heavy cavalry if it had it. So here it's maybe ideally talking about this, but it doesn't explicitate that, because it doesn't say that that the shield is in the front of the enemy, of the horse's chest. It's always obviously talking about the horsemen. But here the only, I think, logical explanation is that there is the unarmored horse in the front. And by the way, also the horse head kind of protects you part of your abdomen, at least frontally speaking. So that's the degree of approximation that these sources tell us, but it's nevertheless important. However, there is one major reason for which he may be saying this, that is, if you shoot sideways into a formation, at least, it's way easier to hit into the ranks, right? Because one thing is, because simply there is more to hit from the side of a horse in terms of surface than there is in the front. The same, it's not true for human beings, for instance. So that can be one reason, and it still points at the idea that you want to hit the horse at this point, or preferably more in the horse, especially if it's a single target. In fact, afterwards he says this is not true just in a regular battle. So we can imagine where there were formations, solid formations of compact, groups of horsemen that you could shoot into, but also in the pursuits and in the retreats, where normally the formation has either broken, surely from one side because someone is fleeing, it's broken formation, but also from people who run after them, so they don't really keep formation, especially in the pursuit, as runners and that have that specific task. So there are some kind of incongruences, kind of strange, but it's nevertheless interesting, and these are problems of interpretation that you really find in every kind of source at this time. Byzantine treatises, it's full of this. So let's pass to chapter 45, that is titled "How to Train in the Precision," right? Firing with precision. So here it basically talks about a device that I've made a kind of a very elementary, rudimental painting of, call it painting, a drawing, it's better to say, that however renders the idea. So here it talks about the targets that are used to train the archers. It says the targets towards which those who train have to shoot have to be okay. Here it makes a list. Then it talks about the most complex one that I was talking to you about now. It says, however, that initially those who have to start training must shoot at targets that have to be both high and large, because these are suitable for the beginners, right? And there is one reason, that you don't have to demoralize the beginner. So here it says that those who are still not capable can hit more easily. And then it says only afterwards you have to gradually reduce the dimension of the target so that they become narrower and therefore kind of more difficult to hit. And then he motivates by saying, if in fact shooting you basically you miss from both sides after the first training, you will miss not more than much relatively to the height of the target, right? So here it says basically it's more difficult to calibrate and it is kind of true, I believe, because usually, well, this depends obviously how large the target is, but and how high, especially what their dimension is. But here basically says you have to reduce progressively. Then usually people tend to miss mostly at the sides of the target rather than in its height. And in the end, then it says you have to reduce gradually also the height, and you will have to start to use also circular targets. This is important. So he's entailing that he was using kind of rectangular targets or quadrangular targets and then circular ones. The reason being that naturally the circular ones are given the same size of the square. You can inscribe them into they have less surface. So the circular terms of dimension, still the circular shape is more difficult to hit. And I would say it's also kind of more similar to, maybe what kind of head or other kind of shapy parts of a human body that can represent. Then it says the targets you can shoot to which you have to shoot can be rather full, can be either full or hollow, or some of them can be provided with circles with different dimensions, so that you can shoot first to the larger ones, then to the one of middle size, and therefore to the smaller ones. So it's simply like the shooting sports, like the bullseye shooting. You can aim at this increasingly smaller targets to test your effectiveness, your skill. Then it says the shooters must actually also train to hit targets in movement, both the natural ones like birds or feral animals, or artificial ones like some targets dragged or pulled by the distance with some cords like balls or other similar objects. So this is interesting because it basically says, especially relatively to the animals, that these troops were trained by hunting, de facto. And here also talks about these other objects like sphere-like, like a ball that can be trained with some cords. So I don't know in which way this was really done. Naturally, the animal here, there were still kind of objects on the ground apparently, and aside from birds, naturally fly. So this is also important, but relatively to the other artificial objects, it doesn't talk specifically about thrown objects, at least here. So, or maybe they were pulled. Well, here it really says dragged, pulled. So maybe there were not things like thrown, like in a sling-like fashion, but still tied with a cord. So it would be interesting how they did that. Then he says, in this way, therefore, those who exercise for every convenience will make use of this ability in shooting, also in the moment of truth, right? So also in real combat. And here, chapter 46, how you have to shoot with force. And here it's actually that part in which there is the strange device, not before. And here he basically explains how to create a device that measures the force with which the arrow hits the target, right? So here it says shot power can be obtained both with a bow that is definitively difficult to draw, to stretch, both with a or with a longer arrow, so that the bow has to be more flexed, let's say. So in this way, and this is kind of obvious, right? So you basically increase the draw. You impress higher. Let me see, the higher traction, right? Or pull. Yes, I think it's the same. And you have to act in the following way. By the way, no, you said, excuse me, and this can be achieved, especially making men competing with each other during the training. So this adds, the kind of cockery these records could have. I pulled more, etc. So kind of increasing even the competition and spirit of unity and all this. I don't know even what I'm saying. Let me check if I can. Esprit de corps. I wanted to look for an English term. The French one is more effective. Esprit de corps. That comes also through competition. Then, however, it says you have to act in the following way to measure. Here I add the strength, and you have to fix a stick perpendicularly to a base, and you have to fix on it a disc of wood squarely with the stick, and on the superior surface of the disc you have to trace a series of radial lines not less than 360. And in at the center of the disc you have to fix this, in correspondence with the center of the disc, you have to fix a cylindric iron hinge, which basically stays on the top of the stick, actually on the superior side through the disc, and to the hinge you have to fix a wooden circle disposed as a target perpendicularly to the disc, and it has not to be thicker, not less than 3 fingers. There is roughly like 5 centimeters and a half, and with a diameter of 2 spans, that is roughly 46.8 centimeters. And the circle has to be attached in such a way that he's nor too rigid nor too mobile when he gets hit by the arrows, right? So here there is some attrition he makes with the disc, and you have to calibrate that. So these Byzantine treatises are relatively very theoretical and ideal. You never will say that in the conclusion, but you never have to take literally what was done, because obviously there were kind of different ways to measure this. This could be a good one, but at the same time, you can also measure such things without necessarily, have to make such measurements, also because, as we'll see now, I think you have already understood, basically this disc shifts when it's hit. At every time you hit him, but and therefore you can measure with the angle of the shift how strong that hit really was. But it also depends from which angle you hit, and all this stuff. But it's still, sort of fair way to do that. There are also other ways you can calculate that. For example, just making seeing how many times the disc revolves around the stick through the hinge, even though you have to still count that. So this was some kind of effective method, but it doesn't really tell how it was calibrated effectively. Whatever. Here it says, however, against the disc you have to shoot the arrows with the iron head, but without a point. This is important because probably, maybe they wanted to. Obviously, if the arrow had remained stuck, aside from the fact it would have progressively destroyed the disc, probably by fixing it to the wood. But this was a way to not really maintain the arrow attached to it while it was moving after the hit, so that maybe if the arrow was pointed with a different angle, was maybe interfering with the device in itself, could still slow down with attrition the speed of the circle moving and kind of falsifying the dual measurement. So basically, we wanted this arrow to still have that barycenter shifted towards the top. That was made heavier by this iron head, but without the point, right? And so that it would just bounce over the disc. Then here it doesn't say how the point has to be, but that would be important because there are various kind of physical problems with the angle, etc., depending on which kind of iron head you have. But here it doesn't specify it, so who cares at the end of the day? So it says the mark of the major or lesser impact of the arrows is indicated by the shift of the circle by the lines of traced on the disc. And a weak shot can move the circle, let's say, with one line, while the more powerful one make it a shift of 2 or even more lines, right? So this is kind of clear, and it's definitely aimed at seeing how hard a hit was. And aside from the technical, from the device and all the various problems, but you can understand that this is a kind of intuitive way of how to measure a hit. And what is important here is the emphasis on the strength of the hit, right? That it had to be strong, that it didn't just take to hit the target, that, as we have seen, wasn't this big thing. It was like only 46 centimeters of diameter. So here it doesn't actually say at which distance it was you had to shoot from, but that at that point it was a matter of competing, or at least observing how different shots, even from a single shooter, could be more or less powerful. The important there is how hard, so how strong that shot was, and you wanted it to be particularly effective. So this had a great importance, because in battle, naturally, even arrows cost. So if you shoot them, you have to try to make at least a good use of it, and to hit hard, harder, hopefully, than the enemy can hit you. In here, chapter 47, it says how to shoot rapidly, which is equally important. You don't have just to shoot powerfully, but also with a decent fire rate, because speed rate, because otherwise, it's not the same thing. Here it says it starts off by saying something very important, that shooting rapidly is not much a matter of technique, rather of constant practice, and it's achieved in the following way. So this is very interesting. It says it doesn't matter really how you are used to shoot, but the important here really, at least for what concerns the speed, is that you make constant exercise, right? So this is obvious. You kind of fluidify your fire rate the more you use it. It has to be shooting with arrows not very easy. It's something you have to do swiftly enough, and with some comfort, with some kind of even sixth sense or instinct at that point that derives from having done it lots of times, and so that you can learn how to do it automatically in every situation. This is even how we train soldiers today. I mean, for shooting, we don't even tell them how to do it. However, they have to be extremely reactive to it. That they have to be used to do that thing as they have used to do it so many times, right? So then he goes on and says a shooter of a very particular, a particularly good, effective shooter in rapid fire shoots interruptedly the arrows over a certain target. The other participants to the training dispose themselves over a straight line together with him, and they shoot with the bow, aiming his own same target. The arrows have to be named with the names of the shooters of some other sign of distinction, and the beginning and the end of the shooting do not happen at will of the shooters, but at a given signal that basically indicates when it's begun, and when it's ended. So when everyone has stopped to shoot in this fashion, the arrows of each one are counted, and it is clear that they will find more arrows. The more arrows of who has more rapidly shot, and less arrows of those who have more slowly shot. And this creates competition among the shooters to establish who is the most rapid one. So this is particularly effective because you don't really have just the problem of aiming correctly, but also of shooting fast. So you kind of combine the two things, because you can shoot fast but still not hitting. So plus there is this general competition. So it's like a game. You test that with other shooters, and they have to balance the things out. Have to be precise enough, but also fast enough. And it's obvious that the more precise you are, the more time you take for aiming, but and the faster you are, but the more precise you get, the less precise you get. So there must be an optimum at the end, right? That brings to refining the skill and to become a better shooter at the end of the day. Then he says there is also another method that is specifically thought for training to shoot in movement. That happens in this way. After having taken bow and arrows, a shooter of the best ones advances rapidly along a straight line and shoots the arrows sideways for a certain amount of time. When he's done, his arrows are recollected, and to their place, so where they have fallen, are placed some signals that constitute the first line. And again, from the other side, actually, so this is, imagine two parallel lines. The one the guy has shot these arrows has gone, and then another parallel line that is 56 meters away. Here the measure in the Byzantine text is 30 orgiae or orgiae. That is not a few, 56 meters, and basically on this distance of 56 meters are posed other signals, so that basically you have this, imagine this line that goes kind of all in zigzag fashion, and you have the same exact copy in parallel 56 meters away. And bear in mind that so this is modeled on the spot of arrows that have been shot by a particularly fast shooter. So hopefully a shooter that the others have to learn how to reach and to match, hopefully. So according, and then it says, and goes on, and that according by following accurately the second line, the participants, one of the other, will throw the arrows towards the first line in order to hit the in reaching the up to the last signaling point. So all these various steps, and if we can say the stopovers, or actually the leg of the stage, right? And therefore here their objective is simply going across this path and trying to shoot at those targets. And here it doesn't say it, but technically they should be able to do it at the same speed that the guy has, or the first guy has shot those arrows, because otherwise you can take all the time you want. You simply stop in one point and you try to shoot at 56 meters the corresponding target of the other line. That is, so this has, it doesn't say it explicitly, but it's obvious that if you want to achieve speed in shooting, that you should be doing that at the same exact speed that that our guy has done it, right? So this is actually pretty simple, and it's how it works. So, and then I would like to make you reflect on how modern horse archers train, because that's particularly interesting. So here I have downloaded basically this path, this stage used in the Hungarian horse archery today. And this is particularly interesting because what you see here, it's a path of 90 meters, right, that the horseman has to run across along like a line, right, straight ahead from all this 9 meters long. And then on the left side, so the one that naturally this is not conceived for left-handed people, but I believe that in this sports as well as in, well, it's actually pretty easily to reverse the thing, but let's say that the information sometimes, well, I don't think it even made a big deal of difference, but there's way even for left-handers to easily train, and just like right-handers do. So I don't think it's a big deal. But the important here is that you have this target that is placed basically at the height of this of the 45th meter of this path, perpendicularly 9 meters away. So basically what you have is that from meter 0, so when you start, the target is 45 meters away, and it's the it's diagonally placed, as you see. And then when you get in the middle of the track, you have at the 45th meter, it's basically perpendicular to you on left at 9 meters of distance, so it's closer. And when you get to the end of at the 90th meter, it's still 45 meters away. Now, the task is, so the target is multifaceted basically, and here in the competition you see that there are 3 targets basically placed on the target, 3 circles that you have to hit, but naturally it can be just like one big round circle. Now I don't know about the dimensions of the target, but the important thing here is basically the angle of fire, because paradoxically what you have is that when you're 45 meters, let's take the extremes, when you are the farthermost from the target and when you're the closest to the target. So when you are 45 meters away, you have an advantage that basically, I mean, you know, it is true that you're you're 45 meters away from your target, but still the angle at which you proceed varies much less. So in other words, basically when you point at the target this distance, the target moves from your position while you're in movement in turn. Theory of relativity entailed. It kind of you have to aim at it way by moving very slowly, right? So it's kind of easier to point at that, even though you're on horseback, so it's not easy at all, but it's still easier than when you arrive instead at the closest of the target. Then it's only 9 meters away, so you're much closer to it. But at the same time, there is this moment in which you arrive exactly perpendicularly at the target, in which the target is moving pretty fast, because you're moving compared to it much faster. So the angle varies much more rapidly at that point, and it's much more difficult to aim in that sense, at least in terms of the angle of your own shot. And so it goes. And you see here that the interesting thing is also that when you surpass the target, so you're going the last 45 meters, you're shooting backwards. So when you're in the first 35 meters, you're shooting basically ahead and sideways, right? Increasingly sideways. Then when you're moving the other 45 meters, you're shooting backwards and increasingly, let's say, in not sideways, I mean straightly. And the timing in here by is very precise, because these 90 meters have to be ran at a given speed that is basically 16 seconds, right? So this means that you have to run to go on horseback at a pace of 20 kilometers per hour. There's not really a few, and these 20 kilometers per hour are very interesting because they kind of give you probably the fair speed in which even kind of ancient horse archers probably went to, I mean, not in absolute terms, but maybe to have this kind of optimal shot at that specific distance. Now, I personally don't know whether these modern tracks and horse archery sports are modeled on more ancient traditions that had to take into consideration even things like the penetration of enemy armors or shields and all that stuff. I don't really know, but I suspect it probably has to do indirectly with that. Obviously, it has nothing to do anymore like that. I mean, obviously the variables have changed, the bows have changed, so there's something very very abstract and detached from that original thing. But it still can tell us enough about certain things about how this thing worked. First of all, shooting 20 kilometers an hour. Full gallop is something like 45. Actually, it's for cavalry charges, it's never speed has never been superior to 45 kilometers per hour, ideally. I mean, if you go in full gallop, so it is way faster than this, formations tend to break. These were horse archers, though, so they usually didn't charge. So their speed was usually higher, but they had to take into consideration that the speed has to entail now even the precision. So as we were saying before, when it comes to hit great masses of men, I mean, screw accuracy. You can just shoot in the middle of it and still hitting them. And this is particularly evident during a battle where there is a freaking mess going around, but it's somehow, some sort of, you can still shoot all. You have to think how to shoot effectively all together. So this thing was probably very orderly, at least in the way the horses were cyclically sent out there in swarms to practice this. So there was still some cohesion to maintain. Usually then this could also kind of disappear given the mass of a battle and all the anxiety and stress, etc. But also the horsemen were literally not running always around, because even the runner has to rely on speed, but definitely has to exhaust itself more than much, right? Even if that's what a runner has to do. So even this distance of 9 meters can be, the closest you want to reach to an enemy. Probably they made circular, approaches to the enemy. I don't know whether they actually went really frontally, let's say, upwards of backwards. There's kind of the Cantabrian cycle that is kind of a circle in front of the enemy line, so that this is not a circle that you see, but you can think of it if you want. So with the closest distance you get, where you basically pass just like with your horse perpendicular to the enemy ranks, and that you're able to turn away, that is probably the best way, because you're keeping to run with your horse. I mean, if you arrived frontally to the enemy, you would have to turn your horse, which means to stop, and then to stop for a while. It's kind of dangerous, and then going backwards, losing a lot of time. In this way, instead, you kind of expose the flank, but also you pass more rapidly. So you have the same problem that these shooters have when they pass in front of the target that's closest perpendicularly, because they're kind of more difficult to hit, but it's still an enemy formation theoretically. So it's probably these circles were somewhat calibrated to remain at that specific distance in which they could get the closest to the enemy without risking too much in shooting continuously. So with the horsemen reloading the bow and passing once again in front of the enemy formation along the circle, and that point of the circle, and shooting once again. So and naturally they could shoot at many other angles at the same time, but that definitely, the closest you shoot from, the most effective it is. So that's what horse archer tactics were fundamentally all about, to get the closest to the enemy, to shoot that freaking bow and to cause the highest damage, right? And in this competition, modern competition, you realize that the best shooters in this track can score, that is to hit the target, 12 from 10 to 12 times. So it's basically one arrow. Remember that this is a track that has to be run in 16 seconds, right? 90 meters in 16 seconds. It's not a slow speed, and therefore there is one shot that hits in less than 2 seconds. So imagine the rate of fire of a trained horse archer, especially of someone who has spent literally his entire life on horseback, like a Hannick horseman could be. One arrow centering the enemy less than every 2 seconds. That's amazing. And this doesn't tell you, in fact, how many arrows have been shot. So technically, the shooting, I think it's I mean, in this tracks in sport, probably they tend to shoot that, obviously what is humanly possible to shoot, obviously balanced with even the needs of accuracy, but it's very high rate of fire, very high. And just imagine when you have hundreds, if not thousands, of enemy horsemen doing the same thing in front of you over and over and over and over again. That's why, for instance, Surena against Crassus at the Battle of Cataract had brought an enormous amount of arrows that were tied, brought with camels in there. Just so there were actually very few horse archers, but they could basically shoot at the Roman legionaries unopposed by reversing this huge amount of arrows continuously. So just imagine what it means to be under that enemy fire. Against composite bows, it can even pierce to your shields and your armor, as the same Procopius says. So just imagine what it means. And this is way worse psychologically than physically. I mean, obviously it's way worse to be hit by an arrow, but in terms of, if you really have to shake a formation and to destroy it, what matters in there is the chaos that follows, like the freaking mess that arrow fire can make at that rate and that with that volume of fire, right? So this is pretty serious, and so you can imagine even 10 horsemen going in circle, what kind of continuous fire they can deliver on you by shooting all together when they pass, let's say, from the half of the circle that is facing the enemy. And that's why you understand that these tactics remained pretty much effective until basically the discovery of firearms, like the real moment in the decline of the tactics of the steppes that evidently up to one point nobody had managed to cope with, at least in the most advanced, I guess the most dreadful armies that were kind of the best equipped. Think about the annihilation of European armies against the Mongol armies. They all worked they didn't work just with arrow fire. Of course, they worked even with charges of Mongol heavy cavalry and tactics and ambushes and all this stuff. But it's not before pike and shot tactics to kick in the 16th century that these peoples are being able to be defeated. That's in a nutshell how the Russians managed to conquer Siberia, by adopting pike and shot tactics, because that was something that otherwise they had up to that point had done nothing but imitating the same the same steppes tactics. And I made some videos on Russian tactics in that period, in the Renaissance, in fact, not explaining specifically this, but especially horse archery practiced among the same Russians, so that before the introduction of pike and shot tactics, were basically fighting in the same exact way Tartars did, right? So I think this was interesting, and definitely we will talk more about Byzantine archery. That is a quite fascinating topic, as you understand. Today we have looked a bit at the reasons. But it's a very wide topic, and naturally this was just for the 6th century. Now we would have to look at even at other ages at one point, and we will see. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.